Well, commemorations are being held this Sunday for the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Paris. The arrival of Allied forces ended 1,500 days of Nazi occupation and a week of fighting led by the resistance. Commemorations began at midday with the raising of the French flag under the Eiffel Tower. A military parade then followed the path of the first soldiers to enter Paris from the south on August 24th, 1944. It culminated in a ceremony presided over by French President Emmanuel Macron and Paris Mayor Anne Hidalgo. Well, here's the French president speaking just moments ago.
Ce que les soldats de la 2e DB et le général de Gaulle découvrirent.
What the soldiers of the 2nd DB Regiment and de Gaulle discovered when they entered Paris. In front of their eyes, in the capital, the face of resistant France. The face of Paris, which had not waited for them to launch the insurrection. On August the 25th, 1944, the 1,532-day nightmare came to an end.
Sonnait la fin d'un cauchemar de 1532 jours.
Well, for more on these commemorations, I'm joined on set by our chief foreign editor, Robert Parsons. Rob, the liberation of Paris now feels like this key moment in the defeat of Nazi Germany, but at the time there was actually some disagreement about how important it was.
Yeah, absolutely. The Allies were pressing the Germans back. They had successfully broken out of the Normandy area after the landing there. They were making progress up from the south of France after the landing in Provence. And they saw their key priority, not just Paris, which had a relatively small German garrison of about 25,000 men, not particularly well equipped either, which was getting smaller because their equipment was being taken away to help German divisions that were coming under pressure from the British and the Americans, both to the north of Paris and to the south. So that they saw their priority as pushing the Germans to the south, back as fast as possible towards the German border, perhaps even to break into Germany and move towards Koblenz. In the north, the British and the Canadians and others are trying to push the Germans back towards Belgium. So they saw the idea of taking Paris at that time as being, just not the priority. So the commanding officer, General Eisenhower, had said that he didn't want to really concentrate on Paris, at least until the beginning of September, but was coming under a lot of pressure, obviously, from the French, because the situation inside Paris itself was tense. The Parisians could see the way the war was going. They were anxious to get involved in some way. They wanted to be free from the Germans. But realistically, they weren't able to do it by themselves. There were resistance fighters there, but they only had about 400 guns, weapons available to them at that stage of the war. So General Leclerc, we heard reference to him just now in the 2nd Armored Division of the French Army, working with the Allies in France, was really keen, supported by General de Gaulle, to get moving forward, to take the initiative and go into Paris, partly for the prestige, of course, but he also wanted to make sure that before things moved on, that the capital city of France was at last under full control over the French army.
And Rob, Paris now marks, a whole week of commemorations that stretch from the 19th of August to the 25th. Can you kind of walk us through what happened leading up to the 24th and the 25th, when soldiers actually entered the city?
Yeah, I mean, it's sometimes suggested that things took rather a long time, that they moved slowly, but, not really, I think, is the answer to that. Things didn't really start getting hot. Obviously, there have been incidents involving the resistance for a long time inside Paris, but they didn't really become systematic until August, with strikes taking place from about the 12th, the railway workers, police force refusing to go to work in their uniforms. And then the communist newspaper L'Humanité issued a declaration on the 15th of August calling the people of Paris to come to arms. And then the barricades started appearing on the 19th and the 20th, not in places, in the center, not in the 16th arrondissement, not in the 6th or 7th, sort of prestigious areas of Paris, more to the north and more to the east, the more the sort of working class areas of the city. And then the Gaullists started to move into buildings. They took control of the Hôtel de Ville, the mayor's office. They took control of ministries and various other important public buildings. And then the momentum started to rise. As I was saying, they were not very well armed, 400 men, but they really needed the French army and the Allied forces to come into Paris before they could push the Germans out. The Germans, on the other hand, were aware of just how vulnerable their position was, because, as I was just saying a moment ago, they were down to a pretty small garrison, 25,000 at its peak, already reduced by that. A lot of desertion was happening. A lot of their weaponry was being sent to help the German forces elsewhere in France. So they knew how vulnerable they were. They controlled pockets of resistance, pockets inside the city of Paris. Areas like the École Militaire, Les Invalides, and places like that. They had forces of a reasonable size, but they didn't have full control of the city. So when, from about the 24th, the French forces broke into Paris, it was pretty easy for them. They cut through the south of Paris, crossed the Seine, moved into the Hôtel de Ville, and then the following day, forces moved in from the southwest and the west. And things happened pretty fast after that. By the 25th, the Germans were surrendering.
Yeah, as you said, it started in the south of Paris. And one thing that many people may not realize is that most of the first Allied soldiers to enter Paris were actually Spanish. The 9th Company of the March Regiment of Chad was known as La Nueve, Spanish for the Nine, because the majority of its men were Spanish Republicans. Well, our reporter Karima Yawi went to meet some of their family members, and Charlotte Hughes brings us his report.
On the walls of this building in Paris is a mural in memory of soldiers whose role in helping to liberate the French capital had long been forgotten. They're Spanish soldiers who were among the first to drive into Paris on the 24th of August 1944. Carmen discovered almost by chance that her grandfather was one of these men.
My interest was sparked when a cousin showed me a photo published in a local newspaper in Almeria. It was the big photo of La Nueve in England. He said to me, "I think your grandfather is there. Can you confirm that?" I said, "Yes, indeed he is." That's how I started exploring. I didn't know anything about my grandfather's military past.
Carmen's grandfather, José Gongola Zubieta, joined the 9th Company of the Régiment du Marche du Chad, part of the 2nd Armoured Division, commanded by General Philippe Leclerc. 146 of the company's 160 soldiers were Spanish. This earned the company the nickname of La Nueve, meaning ninth in Spanish. Many were communists or anarchists who had fought against Franco's dictatorship before fleeing Spain.
They had war experience. Most of them had already fought in the Spanish War. They wanted to fight for freedom.
The story of these men was long left out of the French history books. In his victory speech, General de Gaulle did not mention the Spanish soldiers, and it was only in 2004 that Paris officially acknowledged the contribution of La Nueve to its liberation.
There was a lack of recognition of all foreigners. It was de Gaulle's speech to unite all French people behind the banner of Free France. That's why all the foreigners were erased from the speech. There's been a whole historiography in which this field has been obscured.
The company's vehicles bore names including the Guernica or Don Quixote, but when cinema tells the story of the liberation, it's a vehicle with a French name that first drives into Paris.
Entrée à Paris le 24 août à 20h.
Among these men spearheading the fight against fascism was Jacques' father.
Moment du 50e anniversaire.
He was still alive at the time of the 50th anniversary of the liberation of Paris. He was being interviewed by a journalist, and I was there. He was asked what he thought about his Spanish friends. He started to cry.
The work of historians has gradually shed light on the role of La Nueve in the liberation of Paris. Before they died, some of the men were able to receive the recognition they deserved. They include Manuel Arroyo, who was awarded France's highest honour, the Légion d'honneur, in 2004. After the liberation, many of these men had hoped to continue their fight against fascism in Spain. But lack of support from France meant they were unable to, and many died in the country which they had helped to liberate.
Well, for more analysis, we can bring in Paul Woodage, D-Day historian based in Normandy. Thank you so much for joining us today. That report we just saw highlights an overlooked group of Allied forces. Are there any others who tend to sort of get left out when we remember the liberation of Paris?
I think the American 4th Infantry Division that followed up behind. Not that the Americans are lacking in being involved in the liberation, but they were in support of the French 2nd Armored Division, and without their assistance, I think it would have been a tall order for the 2nd Armored Division, the French unit, to liberate Paris on its own. So the Americans are integral as well. But to me, it's de Gaulle. It's all de Gaulle's story. He is the most important force in all of this.
Yeah, there is that famous speech by de Gaulle, Paris broken, Paris martyred, Paris liberated, liberated by itself. How important do you think the liberation of Paris has become in France's sort of national narrative?
Well, in France's national narrative, it's absolutely essential. I mean, this is the single event that puts de Gaulle back, or not so much back, but on the international stage. We kind of have to remember back, he wasn't part of the overlord planning. He was briefed about what was going to happen. The French 2nd Armored Division, Normandy, were kind of a secondary role there. But the moment de Gaulle speaks in Paris, that's it. He's sealing himself as being an incredibly important figure in the future, but he's sealing France as still being a major player. And there they are, 11 months later, they're one of the 4 powers in Berlin. That probably wouldn't have happened without Paris, without de Gaulle, without that incredible coming together, the unity he brought of all the different factions and the resistance units and the journalists. It was a masterstroke by him.
Rob, I want to come back to you. Paul Woodage there talking about how important Charles de Gaulle was, how important this was for his legacy. Would you agree?
Absolutely. No question about it. He only came back from Algeria to France on August the 19th, but he understood how important it was for him and for his forces to take control. I put the accent on his forces, on the Gaullist forces, to take control of Paris, and for a number of reasons. Obviously, the symbolism of taking the French capital, being there, for the march past and all those things, the prestige involved in liberating Paris, and the morale boost for the French people and being at the head of that. But just as significant, if not more important, was the political aspect of it, because he understood very well what the challenge of the Communist Party was going to be in France once this war was over. The Communist Party had played a critical role in the French resistance and was well positioned in Paris. We were just talking about the call by L'Humanité, the Communist Party newspaper, for people to take to the streets. The Communist Party in the resistance, very active in the barricades and the street fighting. But de Gaulle put his accent on taking control of the city through control of its key buildings, through its ministries, the Hôtel de Ville, and obviously the role of the 2nd Armored Division that I guess was just referring to now. Once that was in place in Paris, de Gaulle had pretty much control over the city and was able to use that moving forward to ensure that he could keep the Communist Party at bay. But don't forget, the Communist Party continued to play a really important role in France right up until the 1980s.
In the popular imagination, the liberation of Paris, brings up kind of this image of celebrations, of people kissing in the streets. I know my grandfather was there. It was kind of the crowning moment of his life. Paul Woodage, can you describe a bit about the atmosphere of that day and of the kind of following couple of days when Paris was finally freed?
Well, I mean, you just have to see the footage. I mean, that's all over, the internet, the incredible scenes there. And I think of the scenes, 4 years earlier, the famous weeping Frenchman down in Marseille when the Germans had arrived in the first place. And now this unbridled joy that was happening there. There's no other scenes like it. I mean, I always talk about in the summer of 44, you've got Rome that was sort of liberated with a whimper. I mean, there wasn't much of a fight there. Then you've got Warsaw. That was an absolute tragic uprising. And I can't help but not, I always remind myself to put Paris and its liberation into the context of what else was happening in Europe that summer, because at the same time, Warsaw is absolutely being destroyed. And we can't help but think what would have happened in Paris if Eisenhower hadn't diverted the troops towards Paris. What would have happened there? Those scenes of joy that you're talking about could have been something very different.
And the liberation of Paris, of course, was not the end of the war. Can you also just walk us through what happened afterwards?
Well, in some ways, it caused a bit of a backlog with the Allies, because the supply issue that was mentioned by your guest earlier is that the Allies have got to defeat the German army. The war will not be open until they have knocked out German divisions, German tank divisions. And Paris was a sideshow in some ways. I always refer to Omar Bradley's quotation of Paris represents nothing more than an ink spot on our maps to be bypassed as we headed towards the Rhine. That's what he's thinking. And the diversion of fuel and ammunition and food, particularly to Paris, meant that as the next few weeks push on, there is a bit of a problem with supplies in the Allied army. I mean, the problem was going to be there anyway, but Paris just kind of makes it worse. And it means that by the time, I mean, obviously the Allies get to the Belgium and the Netherlands very quickly, but very soon the winter happens, with the winter of 44, 45, the worst of the 20th century. And the Allies find themselves, unfortunately, getting bogged down in the Hürtgen forest, bogged down at the approach to the Rhine. So the excitement of Paris being liberated, within a few weeks, the reality that there's a big, large, still impressive German fighting force that has to be defeated. So they say celebration quickly, well, not quickly, but within a few weeks, turned to the reality of the fact that there's another 9 months of fighting to go.
Now, these commemorations today are also featuring the Paralympic flame. It's being carried by 5 torchbearers who represent towns officially recognized as companions of the liberation. Just briefly, can you talk about, what do you make of the inclusion of the Paralympic flame and kind of that marriage with these commemorations today?
Well, it's absolutely vital. I mean, that anything that now makes Paris, the liberation, a contemporary event, because it is the coming together of everybody. That's what the Allies represent back then, this coming together of people with different ideas of the future of democracy, so to speak, and then including people from diverse backgrounds is incredibly important to make that liberation sing to everybody. It's not just for military historians like myself. The liberation of Paris and what it represents is everybody's story. So I think it's a really, really good thing to see that everyone's getting involved in it.
And Rob, I think we just have time for you to make one final comment.
Yeah, just one thing to say is that what we have to remember too, I think, is that the genuine fears among the French. And I guess just mentioned the city of Warsaw there and what the Germans did to Warsaw, completely destroyed it. There were real fears on the French side that the Germans would do exactly the same. And they had good reason to fear that as well, because Hitler had appointed a new general to take charge of Paris just before the events we're talking about today happened. At the beginning of August, he appointed General Choltitz. General Choltitz had a pretty brutal reputation in the Soviet Union for the treatment of the Jews. But he was also given orders just before he left from Berlin to come to France, to hold Paris, to fight until the last man. And a few days later, Hitler got in touch with him and said he should destroy Paris if it looked like he was going to lose it. He had already taken a decision before that, having spoken to his general staff, that there was no military benefit to be gained from the destruction of Paris. So he wasn't going to do it anyway. But for the people of Paris, who didn't know about that decision having been taken, there was a genuine fear.
Yeah, so lucky that Paris not only was liberated, but also liberated with all of her beauty intact. We'll have to leave it there. That brings us to the end of this edition with a special look at those commemorations for the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Paris. I want to thank our chief foreign editor, Rob Parsons, as well as our guest, British D-Day historian Paul Woodage. Thanks, both of you, so much. Thanks to all of you for watching. Stay with us if you